There's a specific kind of tired that has nothing to do with sleep. You've prayed the same prayer so many times that it doesn't even feel like a prayer anymore. It feels like a habit. A whisper you say out of loyalty, not expectation. And somewhere along the way, without really deciding to, you stopped believing the door was going to open. Here's what nobody tells you about that feeling. It doesn't mean God stopped listening. It might mean you're standing closer to the door than you've ever been, and you just can't see it yet. Stay with me for the next few minutes, because what we're about to walk through together might completely change the way you look at waiting. Not with empty comfort, not with a promise that everything happens for a reason, with something steadier than that. Let's start with something most people get wrong about closed doors. We tend to believe that a closed door means no, that if God wanted to give us something, He would have handed it to us already, wrapped up, easy, obvious. So when the door stays shut a little longer, we quietly translate that silence into rejection. We think, maybe I'm not supposed to have this. Maybe I asked for the wrong thing. Maybe I'm being punished for something I did. But think about how doors actually work. A door that's genuinely closed forever doesn't have a handle. It's sealed. It's final. There's no waiting on the other side of it, because there's nothing to wait for. A door that hasn't opened yet, but will, always has a handle. And the strange, quiet reality of faith is that most of us have had our hand resting on that handle for longer than we realized. We just got tired of holding it, so we let go a little without noticing. Here's the part that might be hard to hear, but it's important. Waiting is not evidence of God's absence. Waiting is often the space where He does the deepest work. Think about the story of Joseph for a moment. Not the version we skim over quickly, but the actual shape of it. A young man handed a vivid dream about his future, then thrown into a pit by his own family, sold into slavery, falsely accused, forgotten in a prison cell for years. If you had asked Joseph in year 7 of that ordeal whether the door to his purpose was still open, he probably would have told you it looked sealed shut, and yet every single one of those years was preparing him for a room he hadn't even been told about yet, a room in Pharaoh's palace, where he would end up saving an entire nation, including the very brothers who threw him in that pit. The door wasn't closed. It was being built. That's worth sitting with for a second, because most of us have never once considered that the delay itself might be construction, not rejection. Now, I want to be honest with you about something, because honesty matters more than comfort here. I'm not telling you this to suggest that everything you're currently walking through is secretly a hidden blessing in disguise, and that if you just smile through it, the door will swing open on schedule. That's not how real faith works, and it's not what I believe. What I am saying is this: the ache of waiting and the presence of God are not opposites. You can feel both at the exact same time. You can feel forgotten and still be held. Those two things are not in competition with each other. There's a phrase used often that says, God works all things together for good. People love quoting the second half of that verse and skipping the first half, which actually matters more. It doesn't say all things are good. It says God works within them, even the hard, confusing, unfair things, towards something good for those who love Him. That's a very different promise than everything will feel good right now. It's a promise about direction, not comfort. And direction is actually what most of us are desperate for when we're in a waiting season. Not comfort, certainty that we're not wasting our life standing still. C.S. Lewis spent a great deal of his writing wrestling with exactly this tension, the space between what we want immediately and what we're actually being shaped into. One of the recurring ideas in his work is that we often mistake the version of ourselves we currently are for the version we're meant to become, and we get frustrated when God isn't in a hurry to hand the future version His keys early. Lewis often described the Christian life less like a single dramatic rescue and more like a long, quiet renovation. Walls being knocked down we didn't know needed to come down. Rooms being built we didn't know we needed. If you've ever felt like your life is under construction and nobody handed you the blueprint, that's not a modern feeling. That's the oldest feeling in the life of faith there is. So let's ask the real question underneath all of this. If the door isn't closed, if it's just not open yet, what are you actually supposed to do while you wait? Because just have faith is true, but it's also incomplete. Faith isn't passive. Faith has posture. And most people miss that. Here's the first shift worth making today. Stop asking God to open the door faster and start asking Him what He's building in you while it's still shut. That's not a consolation prize. That's the actual point, because the door opening was never the goal. Who you become on the way to it, that's the goal. The door is just where that person gets to walk through. Think about someone in a season most of us recognize. Maybe it's a relationship they've prayed for that hasn't come. Maybe it's a job, a diagnosis they're waiting on, a reconciliation they've asked God for more times than they can count. From the outside, nothing about their circumstance has visibly changed in months. But quietly, in private, something has changed. They've stopped demanding answers and started asking better questions. They've stopped measuring their worth by whether the prayer gets answered on their timeline. That shift, invisible to everyone watching, is the door already beginning to move on its hinges, long before anyone sees light coming through the gap. You may be in exactly that kind of season right now, and I want to say something plainly. The fact that you're still here, still watching something like this, still willing to ask whether God sees you, that itself is not nothing. That's not weakness. That's the most honest kind of faith there is. The kind that keeps showing up, even when it isn't sure it'll get an answer. Let me tell you about someone whose story I've seen play out in different forms, over and over, in different lives. We'll call her the woman at the crossroads, because her situation isn't really about one person. It's about all of us at some point. She had prayed for years for something to change. Not one specific dramatic thing, just a general sense that her life would finally start moving instead of standing still. She watched people around her seem to get their doors opened easily, the job, the marriage, the healing, the breakthrough, while hers stayed shut. And somewhere in year 3 or 4 or 5 of that waiting, she stopped praying about it with any real expectation. She still said the words, but her heart had quietly checked out of believing anything would come of them. Here's what she didn't realize at the time, because you almost never realize it while you're inside it. The waiting itself was rewiring her. She was becoming less anxious about outcomes she couldn't control. She was learning slowly and without noticing how to be steady even when her circumstances weren't. She was becoming the kind of person who could actually receive the door when it opened, instead of someone who would have grabbed it too early and mishandled everything on the other side. That's the part almost nobody tells you about waiting seasons. They're not just something to survive. They're often the only environment where certain kinds of growth are even possible. You cannot rush patience into existence. You cannot manufacture trust overnight. Those things are only built in real time, under real pressure, with no shortcuts available. Which means the very season that feels like it's wasting your life might be the only season capable of producing the version of you that's ready for what's next. I want to be careful here, because I don't want this to sound like I'm romanticizing pain. Waiting is genuinely hard. Some of you have been waiting on something for so long that even hearing the word waiting makes you tired. That exhaustion is valid. It doesn't need to be explained away or spiritually justified. You're allowed to be honest about how heavy this has been, but exhaustion and hope are allowed to sit in the same room together. You don't have to wait until you feel strong again before you're allowed to hope again. Hope doesn't require energy you don't have. It just requires you to keep your hand near the handle, even loosely, even tiredly, even without much confidence left. Let's talk about a passage that gets misread constantly. Jesus says, "Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened." Most people hear that as a formula. Do these three things correctly, in the right order, with the right amount of faith, and the door swings open like a vending machine. But look closer at the verbs. Ask, seek, knock. Every single one of them is ongoing action, not a one-time transaction. It's not knock once, it's keep knocking. The posture Jesus is describing is persistence, not a magic phrase, which means the waiting you're doing right now, the continuing to show up, continuing to pray even when it feels repetitive, continuing to hope even when hope feels foolish. That is not you failing to have enough faith. That is what faith having an active tense actually looks like. Here's what most people overlook completely. They think the miracle is the door opening. It isn't. The miracle is that you're still standing in front of it. Let's bring this down to something practical, because inspiration without direction leaves people feeling stirred up but stuck. So, what does knocking actually look like in an ordinary week? It looks like continuing to prepare for the thing you're praying for, even when there's no evidence yet that it's coming. Someone praying for restoration in a relationship, still choosing to work on their own patience and humility, not because it guarantees the outcome, but because that's who they want to be, regardless of the outcome. Someone praying for a door to open professionally, still showing up fully to the work in front of them today, instead of mentally checking out because this isn't the real thing yet. It looks like naming honestly, in prayer, the specific frustration you're carrying, instead of pretending it doesn't exist. God is not fragile. He can hold your disappointment. The Psalms are full of raw, unfiltered honesty toward Him, confusion, anger, exhaustion, all of it spoken directly to God rather than hidden from Him. That's not a lack of faith. That's what faith looks like when it's being fully honest, and it looks like choosing, on purpose, once a day, to thank God for something that isn't the thing you're waiting for. Not to distract yourself from the ache, but because gratitude has a strange way of loosening the grip that waiting has on your identity. It reminds you that your life is not currently defined only by the one door that hasn't opened. It also looks like paying attention to the smaller doors God has already opened around you. That discouragement has made you too tired to notice. Maybe it's a friendship that's quietly steady. Maybe it's a small skill you've been given that you've stopped valuing, because it isn't the big dream you're praying for. Gratitude for the smaller doors doesn't replace the bigger one you're waiting on, but it keeps your heart soft enough to actually recognize it when it finally does open. And it looks like giving yourself permission to grieve what hasn't happened yet, without turning that grief into bitterness. There's a real difference between the two. Grief says, "This has been hard, and I'm allowed to feel that." Bitterness says, "This has been hard, so I'm going to stop trusting God, or stop trusting people, or stop hoping altogether to protect myself from being disappointed again." Grief keeps your heart open. Bitterness slowly seals it shut, and ironically, a sealed heart is far harder for any door to open into. Even when God finally does bring the answer, here's something worth sitting with. Every closed door you've ever walked past in your life eventually opened at exactly the moment you were ready to walk through it, not a day before. Not because God was making you suffer for the sake of suffering, but because timing and readiness are almost always tied together in ways we can't see while we're inside the waiting. Lewis wrote often about how we tend to want God to be a grandfather figure, someone whose only job is to indulge us, to say yes to whatever makes us comfortable in the moment. But what we actually need, he suggested, is a father someone who loves us enough to shape us, not just soothe us. A grandfather wants you happy this afternoon. A father wants you whole for the rest of your life. Those two things sometimes look very different in the short term. And that difference is often what waiting actually is. There's another thread worth pulling on here, and it's an uncomfortable one. So bear with me. Sometimes what feels like a closed door is actually a closed fist. Ours, not God's. We ask God to open something while quietly refusing to loosen our grip on how it has to look when it has to happen, and what it has to cost us. We want the outcome without surrendering the control, and control is one of the hardest things for any of us to hand over because it feels like safety. If I'm holding on tightly, I tell myself, at least I'm not helpless, but here's the quiet irony. The tighter we grip the outcome, the harder it becomes to receive it, because receiving requires open hands. You cannot be handed something new while your fists are still closed around what you think it's supposed to look like. This is where pride sneaks in, disguised as determination. Pride doesn't always look like arrogance. Sometimes it looks like insisting, even in prayer, that we know better than God what the answer should be and when it should arrive. Humility, on the other hand, sounds like this. God, I still want this, but I trust you more than I trust my own timeline for it. That kind of surrender isn't giving up. It's actually the bravest posture available to us, because it requires trusting a person we cannot see over a plan we can. I want to gently push back on something you may have heard elsewhere, because it isn't true, and you deserve better than empty motivation. You will not unlock your blessing by thinking positively hard enough. God is not a vending machine that responds to the right emotional combination. If your door hasn't opened yet, it is not because you didn't believe correctly enough, or because your faith wasn't loud enough, or because you missed some hidden formula. Some doors take longer because the room behind them is bigger than we imagined. Some take longer because we're not the only person that door affects. And some doors, honestly, we may not fully understand this side of eternity. That uncertainty is allowed to exist in real faith. Pretending otherwise isn't strength, it's avoidance. But here's what remains true underneath all of that uncertainty. God has never once been described in Scripture as forgetful, distracted, or careless with the people who belong to him. Not one time. He is described as a shepherd who knows every sheep by name, a father who counts the very hairs on your head, a God who keeps track of every tear you've cried. That kind of attentiveness doesn't disappear the moment your circumstances get hard. If anything, it becomes more present, not less. So when you feel forgotten in the waiting, that feeling is real, but it is not accurate. Feelings are honest reporters of what we're experiencing. They're not always reliable narrators of what's actually true. Let's return to where we started. The door you've been praying for, maybe it's smaller than you think. A conversation you've been avoiding, a step you already know you need to take, an act of forgiveness you've been withholding, a habit you know is quietly costing you your peace. Sometimes the door we're waiting on God to open is actually a door He's already opened, and we're the ones who haven't walked through it yet. Because walking through it requires something of us. Courage, humility, a decision we've been putting off. And maybe it's larger than you think, a calling on your life you've sensed for years but never had the confidence to name out loud. A relationship, a healing, a fresh start you've quietly given up hoping for because hoping got exhausting. Either way, here is the truth worth carrying with you after this ends. Closer than you think does not mean instantly. It means the distance between where you are and where God is taking you is shorter than despair has convinced you it is. You are not behind. You are not forgotten. You are not being punished. You are being prepared. And preparation, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's slow, even when it doesn't feel like an answer to prayer, preparation is still God working, quietly, faithfully, on your behalf. So here's a simple, honest prayer. If you'd like to pray it with me right now, wherever you are. God, I'm tired of waiting, and I don't want to pretend otherwise in front of you. You already know the door I've been standing in front of. You already know how long it's felt closed. I don't fully understand your timing, and I'm not going to pretend that I do. But I trust that you haven't forgotten me, and I trust that whatever you're building in me right now has a purpose, even the parts I can't see yet. Give me the strength to keep knocking instead of walking away. Give me eyes to notice the small doors you've already opened that I've been too discouraged to walk through. And when the moment finally comes, let me be someone who's ready to receive it, not because I earned it, but because you were faithful the whole way through. Amen. If something in this reached you today, if some part of it felt like it was speaking straight to what you've been quietly carrying, I'd genuinely love to hear it. Leave a comment and share what door you've been waiting on. You never know who else needs to read it in the comments below, and if this encouraged you, consider subscribing. This channel exists for exactly these moments. The quiet ones, the tired ones, the ones where you just need to be reminded that you haven't been forgotten. There's another message waiting for you next, and I think you're going to need it. Because the door isn't the end of the story, it's just the beginning of the next one.